It is 10:30. We're going to get started. We do have a bunch of the committee online, I think with the exception of one person. So they are listening and they will be able to ask questions. But we don't have a quorum in the room, so we don't want to do any bill introductions this morning. So before we get started on the hearing, I've got Senate Bill 373 this morning, prohibiting the use of public monies for lobbying activities. I'm going to have our reviser, Jason Long, step up to the mic and give us a bill overview and open for any questions. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 373 would create a new statute prohibiting the use of public funds for any lobbying activities. I will direct your attention that lobbying is currently defined under KSA 46-225. That is the state governmental ethics statutes. And I've included the bullet points of that definition in the memo summarized in this bill, so you can review that as to what by statutory definition constitutes lobbying activities. Senate Bill 373 would prohibit lobbying activities. It would also prohibit paying membership dues to an association that engages in lobbying. It would prohibit, and this is with respect to public governmental entities, so state agencies, municipal agencies would be prohibited from using public funds to engage in lobbying activities, and that includes paying membership dues to associations that engage in lobbying, employing or contracting for the services of a person whose duties and responsibilities would include lobbying, and providing a gift or campaign contribution for any state or municipal officer or employee who may be running for an election. And so those are generally what is prohibited, and there are lobbying is defined under current law. The bill would allow governmental agencies to communicate with members of the legislature to request legislative action or appropriations that are considered necessary for the efficient conduct of public business and that are made in the proper performance of official duties by the governmental employee or officer who's making that communication. The bill then further clarifies that these requests are necessary when they directly affect the operations of the state, any municipality, or any association representing certain municipalities. So there has to be that direct effect on operations component to be deemed necessary for the efficient conduct of public business. Violations of the act would come under disciplinary action. So there could be employment disciplinary action against the officer or employee. There could also be an investigation and potential fine from the Kansas Governmental Ethics Commission under statutes up to $1,000 for a first offense, $3,000 for a second offense, and up to $8,000 for a third or subsequent offense. The other thing the bill does is repeal two current statutes, KSA 46-295 and 72-9935. I have included a copy of each of those statutes with the memo. 46-295 is a statute requiring registered lobbyists to report amounts of public funds that they receive for lobbying on behalf of a governmental entity. Obviously, those reports would no longer be required if governmental entities cannot expend public funds for lobbying. The education statute 72-9935 simply authorizes boards of education of school districts to employ lobbyists. Again, if they are prohibited from expending public funds for lobbyists, they would no longer have that authority, and so that statute would be repealed as well. This would go into effect July 1st of this year if enacted, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions on the bill? Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Jason. Just to, cut to the chase so I can understand it, this particular bill, if it does become law, lobbyists that come in from like the municipalities and the school board, teachers, all these would be outlawed. or there would not be, the local government cannot hire them to come up here to Topeka to represent them. Is that correct?
That is correct. The local municipal government could not expend their monies for the lobbying efforts of those organizations.
I think that's how I understood it. Thank you.
Senator Holscher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jason. Can you tell me the originating source or organization that brought forward this bill?
No, that's confidential information.
As I read it, though, in, Jason, in section 4B, says nothing in this section will prohibit or prevent an officer or employer of the state or municipality or an association representing such, basically, from communicating to the legislature through the proper official channels. So in essence, would that prevent from them testifying on bills that affected those municipalities? I mean, in essence, they could do the same thing a normal citizen could do with regard to showing up if there's a bill that they don't like. Is that correct?
Well, the exception describes legislation that is necessary for the efficient conduct of public business, and then that are made in the proper performance of the official's duties. And so there are two tests there. The official in coming up and testifying on a bill, it would have to be testimony in support or against a bill that affected the efficient conduct of public business. And then it would also have to be done under their proper performance of their duties. So part of their duties would have to be trying to advocate for legislation that was necessary for the efficient conduct of public business. And so you have kind of a two-part test there as to whether or not an official could come up and testify on a bill. And what their testimony would be would obviously be dependent on this definition, this exception as well. There's certain testimony that may not be permitted under this exception, other testimony that may be.
Okay.
It's fairly clear that in coming up for appropriations would be permitted, that coming up and requesting before the Appropriations Committee for an appropriation-free agency would be permitted. When you get into more substantive bills, such as a bill like this, I'm not sure exactly how the exception would apply.
And I think, I read the neutral testimony from the Ethics Commission. I think they were concerned there was some vagueness in the bill that didn't clarify, or they wanted more clarification. You probably haven't seen that testimony yet.
I haven't seen their testimony. The language is subject to fairly extensive interpretation. It's not real clear as to when the exception would apply, so there would be some interpretation required by the Governmental Ethics Commission to apply that exception.
Any other questions, either in person or online from the committee? Anybody? Senator Fascado's got her hand raised. Senator Fascado, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Jason, just for clarification, this legislation would X out the lobbyist for like the city. So therefore, the city council member or mayor would then directly communicate with us.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that would probably be one of the more a sort of safe harbor for the city if they had one of their own employees or officers communicate with the legislature. Again, that particular communication would need to fall within the boundaries of the exception language under subsection B, or else that officer or employee could be found to have violated this by engaging in lobbying themselves.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All righty. Any other questions online or in person? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. Appreciate it very much. We will, committee then, what we're going to do is do like we typically do, 15 minutes for our oral proponents and 15 minutes for our oral opponents. So I'm not going to limit any one person to 1 minute, but I want to give you the latitude we can, but once the time runs out, the time runs out. So we'll start off with our oral proponent testimony. First comes Michael Austin from Americans for Prosperity. Michael?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for the time. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Michael Austin. I'm the Legislative Director for Americans for Prosperity Kansas, and we are here in support of Senate Bill 373, which prohibits the use of taxpayer funds for lobbying. One of the reasons why we're in support of this bill is while we most certainly understand that lobbying, of course, has its own freedom of speech, we do think that there needs to be restrictions when it comes to taxpayer dollars. And one of those is simply the fact that if you pay for someone to come to the legislature to lobby on behalf, that should be your expressed permission to do so. But when you're using taxpayer funds, you don't have that express permission unless you are an elected official. And so we think that taxpayer funds for lobbying should most certainly be restricted to ensure that only those who are paying dues to an organization to represent them should be properly represented by that entity in the legislature. A couple of other points that we think is also important to take note is part of our written testimony here, where we talk about the unfortunate explosion of local government employment here in the state of Kansas. As I reported in my written testimony, if you look at local government or governmental bodies in the Kansas economy, Kansas is probably either second or third in the most governmental units per capita. In other words, we are massively overgoverned, overburdened. And of course, that has many different economic consequences, but one of which is what we're seeing here on the lobbyist front, where we have, many different entities using taxpayer dollars to, in fact, increase more government. And unfortunately, it creates more of a burden with higher taxes, whether it's property sales, taxed at the local level, that hurts Kansans. Not only that, but it also creates a precedent in and of itself, where you have, of course, contract lobbyists that are advocating for a certain position in the legislature, but it actually might be contrary to what taxpayers actually wish. It's one thing if an elected official comes here to lobby, that's their prerogative, and of course at the ballot box the taxpayers will let their position be known. But when that money is lobbied out to, let's say, organizations that use taxpayer funds, and once again that express permission is not given. And so unfortunately we have unfortunate examples where lobbyists are coming here to testify against their own interests of the people. And so we believe that taxpayer money, if it's going to be used, it should be used to carry out the law, not, of course, to make the law. And as you noted earlier in testimony today, there are a number of exceptions that will still allow the official conduct of business for those lobbyists, such as appropriations, or, of course, if any member of the legislature requests an employee of a municipality or a contract lobbyist to come in and testify, I think that language is clear in the exceptions here of the bill that should be allowed. So we, of course, appreciate the questions, comments, or thoughts and the official process as we move through this bill. As we, of course, understand there might be some ideas to make changes, there might not be any ideas to make changes, but this is part of the official process, and we appreciate the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you, Michael. And I will probably open for questions after we hear from our second proponent testimony, Dennis Hull, who is from Americans for Tax Reform, and Dennis is online, I think. Dennis, are you there?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me today. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Dennis Hull. I am pleased to be here today on behalf of Americans for Tax Reform in strong support of Senate Bill 373. It was a surprise to me, quite frankly, when I discovered that government entities have become the largest spending of lobbying dollars in several states. Agencies and municipalities are spending more money on contract lobbyists than many unions, corporations, and industry associations, and certainly more than the average Kansas resident. Unfortunately, taxpayers are often left footing the bill, not only for the increased spending that government entities tend to favor, but also the lobbying responsible for its success. That may be one reason why taxpayer-funded lobbying is incredibly unpopular. A 2019 poll in Texas found that 91% of Texans opposed this practice. Frankly, lobbying spending data are incredibly opaque, especially for contract lobbyists hired by governments, and it's difficult to pin down any reliable information on how these tax dollars are really being used. ATR believes there is absolutely no reason why certain arms of the government should spend taxpayer money to effectively lobby for itself for bigger government when they already have advocates in Topeka and at home in the form of elected officials. Additionally, as Michael made clear, this bill is crystal clear that when legislative action directly affects the operations of the state, associations and government employees may still freely communicate with the legislature, and that is their right to do so. But as Thomas Jefferson put it so well, to compel a man to furnish for the propagation of ideas he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Members of the committee, that is precisely what taxpayer-funded lobbying entails, and ATR encourages you to put an end to it by supporting this legislation today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dennis. And we completed that pretty fast. There's also written only proponent testimony from Brittany Jones, Brett Anderson, Carrie Sue Vosberg, and James Franco. Committee, I'm going to open it up to questions for our proponents. Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much. I guess this would be for Austin. Is that, I can't remember. Michael Austin, yeah, from American Prosperity. Couldn't remember if that Austin was your first or last name. I'm sorry about that. Again, thank you for coming and your presentation. My question, who is it that contracts the lobbyists to come up here? Are these elected officials that allow them to come?
I do not know I'm not sure I'm in the right position to answer that question.
Okay. Then the second one is more of a principle I like to go by. It's a general principle. Would you agree that government closest to the people should make the laws?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Thank you.
Committee, any other questions? Any online?
Madam
Senator Falscadeau. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question too is for Michael Austin. So have you had individuals from local areas, constituents, did they bring this issue of concern to you?
Partly, yes. Madam Falscadeau, partly yes, partly from our own research and seeing what was happening from other states. I believe Wisconsin had a similar measure to end taxpayer-funded lobbying. We also found efforts in Texas to do something of the same. So because we're a grassroots organization, we pull from many different sources as to what we think good policy not only is, but what can come about here in Kansas.
I appreciate your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Oh, yeah. Who do we have online?
Senator Straub here.
Senator Straub, go ahead.
Thank you. I do have a question, but first a statement. While I agree with the issue of not using taxpayer funds to fund lobbying, I would also be curious if the privately funded lobbying efforts and organizations would consider providing a full accounting of all of their donations and expenditures and from individuals, because we know there's lots of organizations that have PACs and have nonprofit arms, and they're structured so that they can hide a lot of the donors who actually fund the organizations. So with these, example, Mr. Austin with Americans for Prosperity, would they be willing to fully expose their entire accounting and who actually funds the organization?
Thank you for your question, Senator Straub. Being that I'm the legislative director for Americans for Prosperity Kansas, I will unfortunately have to say that it's beyond my pay grade to answer. I cannot speak for not only AFP Kansas, but probably the entire organization nationally as to whether or not donor information should be disclosed.
Did you have a follow-up, Senator Straub?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That really doesn't answer my question, but if we could work on getting that answer, but prior to working the bill, that would be great. Thank you.
I believe 501c4s are a federal tax classification that prevents them from being disclosed. So I don't know if there's any, and maybe Jason could weigh in on this. I don't know if there's anything that we could do at the state level that would change that, to my knowledge. But I'll tell you what, I'll have Elena in our research department, if you could take a look at that. But I'm pretty sure 501c4, that's a federal tax designation, and it does prevent that disclosure or allows for the lobbying. I do have a question, Michael, or Dennis, either one. You know, and I read ahead to some of the opponent testimony, and obviously their argument is that, you know, they perform a function bringing concerns of municipalities and counties up to the legislature. I'm just curious how you would answer that, because, you know, obviously, you know, we get information from those sources. And I also am concerned about, you know, using public funds. You know, how do we balance that equation? How do we still allow people from like Western Kansas that can't afford to come out and testify on behalf of their municipality if they see a bill they don't like, with the concerns over public funding?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think this bill gets at it in multiple different ways, many different ways. And I think first and foremost is what's underlining here in the bill, which is talk about public funds being received, not being used for taxpayer-funded entities, for lobbying activities. There are many organizations that accept dues. This bill in no way prohibits, let's say, dues granting organizations from using those funds to lobby. That is not in this bill in any way, shape, or form. As for those organizations that are solely funded by taxpayer-funded lobbying, I would actually agree with you in saying that they do need to be heard. And there should be an opportunity and a pathway for those individuals and those organizations to come to the legislature, which is why I'm really, I think Section 4, subsection B is, I think, pretty appropriate. If an officer or an employee of a state or municipality or an association representing certain municipalities is brought to by the request of the legislature, that is an exception to this law, as well as requests for legislative action or appropriations that are deemed necessary for the efficient conduct of public business is also an exception. So if there's a request by a legislator to have someone come up and provide testimony, that I think it's pretty clear to me that that should be allowed. And then, of course, any particular request for either legislative action or appropriations, whatever is provided for them either in ordinance or, of course, in statute, is also deemed necessary for the efficient conduct in business. So I think it's important to say that this is not a blanket ban of taxpayer-funded lobbying, but it is restricted, and I think it has to be restricted because you're using public money, taxpayer funds, and you have to make sure that that is being carried out only for carrying out the law, and as opposed to making that law, unless it's done by the request of the committee or the legislature.
So a city, if they saw a bill that was coming through and they were concerned about how it might impact them, they could still come up, submit testimony, talk to people, as a lobbyist would, but it would, and they would be able to expend funds to send a representative on their behalf. Is that?
That is part of what I would deem as the efficient conduct of business through the official channels of providing testimony and lobbying. I would agree, yes.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Longbine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, thanks for being here. I don't see anywhere in the bill where public funds is defined. Jason, do we have a statutory definition of public funding? I guess my concern is there are allocations. As an example, a local chamber of commerce who receives a $20,000 allocation from the city that they're working in. Does that make them exempt? What about tourism that is supported by bed tax dollars? Does that prevent them from coming up? What about an organization that either now or once upon a time received a federal grant or some other kind of grant that may have been a one-time or maybe spread out over multiple years? Does this bill include them also?
Thank you for your question, Senator Longbine. What I would say is I think you're right. It probably would be good to have the revisor come up and provide a definition of what public money is, just so that we're all on the same page. But then what I would also suggest to you is that I think this bill, if it passes, it gives the incentive to properly silo your money, because the questions that what you're asking to speaks to the fungibility of money, right? If you get $1 from one place, does that mean you can spend $1 from another source as well? And I think it just goes to show how we need to make sure that if you are going to provide some sort of lobbying effort to the legislature, you need to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's to make sure that that money is coming from either not taxpayer funds and for dues, or that it falls into one of these exceptions outlined here in the bill.
And Jason, if you would like to weigh in also, I think the question was for you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the term public funds is not defined under the bill. A more general accepted understanding of the term for state law purposes is any funds that are derived from tax revenues, whether that's directly from the taxing entity or derived from the state through taxing revenues that are received from the state, such as an appropriation or a distribution or grant of funds from another governmental entity. What is not clear is whether or not any monies that were otherwise received by the municipality, such as gifts, grants, donations from private sources, would become public funds merely by the fact that they're being held by the municipality. The bill is not clear whether or not those would be considered public funds or not.
So with regard to indirect funding, I think that would have to be well defined before the Ethics Commission could even consider how to apply any ethics violations or things of that nature.
If it's not defined under the bill and state law, then the Governmental Ethics Commission would most likely look back to prior decisions or would create its own interpretation of what constituted public funds for enforcement of the provision.
It's into some gray area. Okay, thanks, Jason. Seeing no other questions, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dennis. Committee, there is neutral testimony from the Ethics Commission from Mark Skoglund. It's I think he's on WebEx. Okay, let's go ahead and hear from Mark on this deal, and we'll open for questions afterward. Mark, go ahead. We're not hearing you, Mark. Post-Chiefs WebEx issues here.
Yeah, is that better?
There, yes, we've got you. Okay, go ahead.
Great. Sorry about that. I'm not, haven't been on WebEx in a little bit. Thanks for the opportunity to be here that way, even though while I'm homesick. So I don't have a lot to add to my testimony. I'm neutral. I'm not testifying as to the merits. I do think that it's important to recognize a couple things. Right now, the way that lobbying regulation occurs in Kansas is we have a very, very broad definition of what constitutes lobbying and a very narrow definition of what constitutes a lobbyist. And the reason why is because it's intended to encompass quite a bit of activity to call it lobbying, but it doesn't really become regulated unless that person in question is a lobbyist. And so this bill does hinge largely on the word lobbying, which doesn't really happen elsewhere in Chapter 46. So it's something that I think is worth paying attention to, that perhaps this bill is broader than maybe anticipated. And the second is I have a lot of concerns about the current language of the exception in terms of what is outlined here. I think there's been a couple of questions. I think there's a couple of questions about what certain language would mean. For example, a previous person testifying indicated that they would deem something efficient conduct, but the problem is that that is not well defined in the bill. Operations aren't well defined. There was a previous question from the committee about public funds, and I actually think public funds I'm less concerned about than indirect public funds, which is what I think gets to the concern of the question, because public funds cannot be used indirectly for lobbying either, which poses some question about how far down the chain is it still prohibited to be used for that purpose. So again, I'm not here testifying on merits, but I just have some concerns about language that I might be able to help resolve. And I'm not sure how immediately to resolve some of the language concerns, but I can answer some questions if anyone has any.
Hey, Mark, committee, any questions? Any online? Yeah, I think obviously we would need to define these a little more clearly so that the Ethics Commission knows the marching orders if this bill were to pass. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much. Now we will open up to oral opponent testimony. And we'll start with Nathan Eberline, League of Kansas Municipalities. We'll do 15 minutes and then open to questions. And so whatever time you cede back to your fellow opponents, I'm sure would be appreciated. Thanks, Nathan.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Eberline. I'm the Executive Director with the League of Kansas Municipalities. That better? All right. Thank you, everybody. I guess I'd like to focus a little bit about the League. We have been in existence for over 100 years, and from a value standpoint, I don't mean to put any senators on the spot, but Senator Thompson, we sat down earlier this year to talk about issues at the local level with short-term rentals. We talked about issues that are facing citizens from a property tax standpoint. Senator Reichman, we've talked about numerous issues where the question comes in, how is this going to affect my constituents? How is this going to affect the big cities, the small cities? And we serve as this conduit to try to help you be in the best position to make your decisions. Oftentimes when I'm talking about the League, kind of try to explain what they are. I note that we end up testifying essentially in every committee other than about education, because the laws that you pass affect our cities in so many varied ways. And without that conduit, it gets very hard. Kind of describe some of the logistics issues that could take place if you're trying to bring somebody in to be that expert and to help you make your decisions. We try to make that a more efficient process. Just on Friday morning, I had a conversation with a small city in western Kansas of a population of 140, and talking about some issues that are very specific to the smallest of cities. They are not going to have somebody in a position to be able to drive all the way to Topeka to be that resource for you to know this is what's going to happen if you move forward on a bill. This last year, I've just been in this position shy of a year, and I went all around the state. The League is not a lobbying firm. That is not the wheelhouse of what we do. We provide legal expertise, we teach classes, we cover just a myriad of subjects trying to put local officials in the best position to govern well, to govern wisely. But this element of the lobbying part is a key piece of it. Whatever laws you pass, we try to put that into accessible bite-sized information so each of the cities can take it and apply it and make sure that they're following the law and doing so properly. While it's not the heart of what we do, it is a critical piece of what we do in helping us to make sure that we are serving our cities effectively. We have plenty of other conferees today can talk about some of the specifics, but this is a bill that causes so many issues in helping our city, putting our cities in a lesser position to do what they do and to do it well, to serve the citizens of Kansas. There's been some comments, both from the Ethics Committee and beyond, about the transparency issues. You guys have enacted a number of laws that require disclosure, both for hours, for dollars, to make sure that it is very accessible what we're doing and what is happening to those taxpayer dollars. It's an essential piece. We are open about what we provide and the benefits that derive from it. So I guess I just want to emphasize the value that we provide. I take it as a deep responsibility to continue to serve you and to serve our membership well. We're happy to stand upon that. So
we'll open to questions after all the opponent conferees for any of the folks. So
thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. Up next is Mike Taylor, the Kansas County Commissioners Association. Mike.
I'm a lot shorter than Nathan. Thank you. I'm here on behalf of the Kansas County Commissioners Association. It represents 362 elected officials around the state, Republicans, Democrats, rural, urban. They've all been selected by their citizens to serve their community. And I'm here on their behalf because most of them can't be here in person. This bill, the way I look at it, is telling a local elected officials, you may only speak when spoken to. A legislator must ask you for your comment. And what if the legislator doesn't ask their local county commissioner? What if they don't call every local county commissioner in their district and say, what do you think about this bill? I am paid a fee, and I'm paid a fee to be the eyes, ears, and when needed, a voice for those elected officials. The bill says communicating with a member of the legislature on the request of such member could be legal. And again, I raise, what if that member, you as a legislator, don't ask? The other thing it says is requests for legislative actions or appropriations are deemed necessary for the efficient conduct of public business. Who makes that determination? What if a county commissioner does show up and testifies on something and a legislator says, wait a minute, that's not appropriate? So there's a lot of gray areas there. Another gray area is, and Senator Longbine, you sort of raised this, prohibiting paying membership dues to an association that is involved in lobbying. Obviously, that could be the league, the KCCA, the KAC. It could also mean, what about the local chamber of commerce? A lot of cities give support to their local chamber or their economic development organization. They lobby. So would that be prohibited in the future? And I would say for all of you, the American Legislative Exchange Council has a lobbyist. Does that prohibit legislators from using state money to attend those events? So there's a lot of gray areas there that I think you really need to look at. And I know it's become a catchy conservative punchline that I'm here using tax money to lobby for more tax money. If you look back at the history, most of the time, what I'm suggesting are bills that would help make government more efficient or commenting on how, you know, this is going to cost your local governments more money, and here's maybe the way we could fix it. So I'm rarely here just saying, give me more tax money. I really urge you to look closely at this because it is a we want to silence you kind of bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Up next is Lon Pishney, Kansas Association of Counties. Lon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Lon Pishney. I'm in my 9th year as a Finney County Commissioner in Southwest Kansas. I am a former board member of the KAC, or Kansas Association of Counties, and I was asked to testify in Jay Hall's place since he's in Washington, D.C. for federal legislative policy meeting. Jay provided you with written testimony on behalf of the KAC, and I respectfully ask that you read it and consider what he said. He points out a lot of statutes and so forth in that. But we are in opposition to Senate Bill 373, and I'll explain that in a couple of ways here in just a little bit. I've been a resident of Western Kansas for over 55 years. I've been an elected public servant in my current role, as well as 8 years on the Board of Trustees for the local community college. And in both of these cases, it has been necessary for our entities to be participants in organizations that hire the services of lobbyists. And it's already been brought up with regard to Western Kansas and the small communities and distance. It's about a 5-hour trip for me to get back home, and there's communities on west and south of me that are another hour or so. And I don't know, Senator Reichman, what it takes you to drive, because I'm not sure how fast you drive, but it takes a while to get in here. And I am only here today because I have family over in Johnson County and spent the weekend with them, and it delayed my return home, but I was able to be here because of an hour drive versus a 5-hour drive. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here with you today. We talk a lot about the lowering taxes, concern about tax dollars, and I'm going to digress just for a second. We are under the revenue neutral statute at this particular point, which is in the spirit of transparency, if I remember what initiated that after the tax lid conversation. But not much is said about the services that need to be provided by the local governments, whether it be county or city, and that's what I'm mainly focused on. But even our community college that has a lobbyist that comes in and lobbies for technical education and so forth. There's a lot of services that need to be balanced with that revenue. The other thing that I would like to highlight in my digression here off of my notes is each of these lobbyists in the groups that I'm associated with, which is KAC, KCCA, and also our KLPG, which is Kansas Policy Legislative Group for Western Kansas, which has been in existence for nearly 50 years, represented by John Penninger and Doug Smith, and I believe they provided written testimony to you, if I'm not mistaken. But each of those organizations that I'm a part of develops its own legislative policy agenda. KAC, each of those organizations. So the lobbyists are mandated, if you will, to follow what that policy is. And if there's something that we as elected officials locally, as local elected officials have said we're for or against that, the lobbyists are speaking on our behalf based on that policy that's been put together by the elected officials, and I've been in a lot of those processes. The last couple of things that I want to mention, and I appreciate the time limit, Mr. Chairman, is in Jay's testimony, he mentions all the services that counties are provided, and we are mandated to do public health, emergency management, law enforcement, road and bridges, solid waste, noxious weeds. And if there's things that are contrary to that, or we need to support in regard to that, we need the help of the lobbyists to speak to that. And the last couple comments, we look at a lobbyist as one that provides information, provides coordination, and is an advocate for the specific groups that they might represent. So with all of that being said, I thank you for permitting us to be here to testify, and I know it's a little unusual for someone to stand in for the writer of the written testimony, but I appreciate your flexibility with that, Mr. Chairman, and I respectfully ask you not to advance Senate Bill 373, and I thank you very much for your public service. Thank you.
Thank you, Lon. Up next, we have Jeff Piper, Kansas Peace Officers Association. We've got about 3 minutes, Jeff. So just an FYI.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'll make my comments brief. You have our written testimony. Just briefly, I'd like to state that the KPOA, Kansas Peace Officers Association, represents 3,200 members of law enforcement throughout the state of Kansas. We are not a union. We are an association. We do not represent individual officers for any type of grievance or anything like that. What we do offer our members is opportunities of training, networking, scholarship funds for their dependents, as well as many other opportunities. Approximately 76% of our funding comes through paid membership by our association agencies. Only 17% of those funds are used for lobbying purposes. We feel that lobbying is important because we feel that part of our mission is to promote sound laws within the state of Kansas to not only benefit law enforcement, but the public at large. We believe that a partnership with lawmakers through our lobbyists is an absolute necessity, that we can speak with one voice on a united front and partner with our lawmakers to educate you on questions you may have as to how laws that you pass will affect the working officers on the streets, as well as other proponents. We know that many times you will call upon our legislative liaison or lobbyist, Ed Klump, when you have questions. Ed is a tremendous wealth of knowledge and is a past law enforcement officer himself. So I will yield it whatever time I have to any of the other representatives. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Up next is Daryl Atterbury, Kansas Chiefs of Police Association. Daryl, still have about 2 minutes left.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I would like to reiterate some of the comments he made, but If this goes into effect, Ed is no longer accessible to you because we pay him through our membership fees. Okay? And Ed, I know, is a great resource for you because you call him with regularity to find out the right way to do things, because the man knows that. He knows what to do, what not to do, from our perspective, for your benefit, for your constituents' benefit. So that would be one thing that I would bring up to you. If he is not there, you've got 100 police sheriffs and about 300 police chiefs you would need to call for access to that information. And I don't think you want to do that. I think you would probably want to make that one phone call to Ed Klump. The current framework, as this is written, would really disenfranchise our organizations. I don't have time as a police chief to monitor all of the bills that impact law enforcement and the people that we protect day in and day out, to then find that one thing to then come up and testify to. And then I've got to, at what point am I a lobbyist if I decide that there is a thing there that I need to speak to and I haven't talked to my legislator? So with that, stand for questions.
Thank you, sir. Jeff Easter, I'm afraid we're out of time on our 15 minutes. I'm sorry about that. But we are going to open for questions. We also have 11 written opponent who've provided testimony on this. So, committee, any questions for our opponents? Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'd like to ask Lon Fisnick to come on up here and welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you for your drive. I, as well as anyone in here, probably more than anyone here, understand the drive we take. Mine's 305 miles one way. Most people in eastern Kansas do not understand that. And there's people another 100 miles on west of me. And I see a lot of problems with this bill and for people to come up on there. My question, though, because we're talking about public funds, the heart of that's how I understand this bill. But isn't it so that a lot of local elected officials are making this choice to have these lobbyists come up here to speak in their behalf? Thank you.
Senator, thank you. And my one-way trip is $315, so that's what they reimburse me for. But if I make a trip here on county business, that it's not just some of the elected officials, it's all of the elected officials. We have our legislative policy locally with our county, as I'm sure most of the other counties do, and then we have the associations that have their legislative policy that's been put together by all of the elected local officials. So yes, that's where it all starts. That's the direction, the instructions, the guidelines that the lobbyists have to follow is, with regard to a pro and a con, is that legislative policy that's been formulated by the local elected officials. And one last point to that is we get that input at the coffee shop, in our local meetings, in our public hearings that we have with regard to budget, and at the ballot box. If the residents of that area don't like what we're doing and what we're spending the money on and the services provided, we're elected out next round.
Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question might be for, let me think here, Daryl or maybe Jeff Easter, since you didn't get to speak. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. If there's no lobbyist, then who testifies? And so I'm guessing one of you has to come up here, and then I'm thinking about, okay, then that impacts your actual defined job duties. Somebody else has to cover that, or that means that things that you would attend to, somebody else has to do. Then somebody else probably has to get hired. So there's still a cost, I'm guessing, that other people probably have to get hired to fulfill the duties then that you aren't able to do, because then essentially you're taking care of watching these bills and potentially coming to Topeka. There's probably additional costs then as far as travel lodging, that cost is probably going to be way more than paying a lobbyist. So there's still then taxpayer-funded testimony. It's probably actually going to cost more. So can you talk to that?
Yeah, and I completely understand the time limits and stuff that you have to put on, but just like today, I drove 2 hours up here to provide testimony on this, and KSA's voice wasn't heard. That's what this bill would do, plain and simple. And so the fact of the matter is that being the KSA legislative chair, all that would fall onto me instead of Ed Klump, which means I would have to live up here to do what Ed Klump does up here. Taxpayer funding is not going to do that. And then the other aspect of that is that, and it would cost more than what our share costs for our share of the lobbyist. The fact of the matter is that it's much better the way it's set up now in a law enforcement arena. Each one of you know Ed Klump. Everybody in this building knows Ed Klump. When they have a question or they want to work on a bill, they call Ed. Ed communicates with us, and then we come forward with whatever our testimony might be or our oral testimony. That wouldn't take place anymore because each individual senator or House member would probably try to communicate with their individual sheriffs or individual police chiefs and not have all the facts, which then you're going to get several different answers from different chiefs and different sheriffs because they're not all on one platform, is how I would answer that, ma'am. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Any other questions from committee online? One more, Senator Holscher.
Maybe Nathan or Lon. Another question I have is, I did ask earlier as far as who brought forward this bill. When I look online and I plug in the bill number, it does show that AFP brought forward this bill. And I'm just curious, as far as your thoughts, we have taxpayer-funded lobbyists that work on behalf of taxpayer interest, where there is transparency as far as the funding. Does it strike you that we have a bill being brought forward by an organization that does not have to have transparency in its accounting, that is trying to basically get rid of those entities?
Much like Mr. Austin's deference to each of you as the lawmakers, I will leave that in your hands to place judgment on it. But again, we teach open meetings and open records all over the state, and our focus is on emphasizing transparency. Our books are open. Everything that we do is open. We're here and we stand bare before you, and again, maintain that we have value and hope that we do.
Any other questions, committee? I do have, Senator Longline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't necessarily have I don't have a question for any of the opponents, but if you decide that you want to work this bill, I do think it needs a lot of work, and I'll tell you right up front, I'm probably not one to help with that because I don't know that I can get to a point where I will support the bill. But the public funds, I think this is extremely broad. As an example, according to Bloomberg, one of our proponents accepted PPP money. And so I'm assuming that that's public money. I'm assuming that they would be prohibited from testifying in the future. So if we decide to move forward this bill, I think it needs a lot of work before we consider it a final product.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Holscher.
Yeah, I also, let me look back here. I had a note here. And maybe this is more for our revisor or other individuals. Do we have post-audit information as far as concerning taxpayer funded lobbyist information?
I don't know if Jason has that answer. Or our researchers do. I'm set on post-audit, and I don't recall an audit in the recent years on that, but we could look through it, maybe have our researchers look through the audits and see.
Yeah, I think there's a legislative research.
There might be, but I'm not aware of it. Any other questions or comments? I do, and maybe Nathan could answer this. From my standpoint, I understand the argument of the opponents, but from the average citizen who does not like what their city is doing or does not like what their county is doing, or maybe their school particularly, they don't like the fact that the NEA or the AFT is publicly funded and schools are teaching things that they don't like their kids to learn. How do you answer that? The average citizen doesn't have a lobbyist. They're very frustrated with the process. I believe that's the impetus for this bill, to be honest. Maybe not aimed at the counties or the municipalities or the Sheriff's Association, but maybe more at the educational component of this bill. How would you answer that? I know you can vote them out, but bad things happen during the interim before they vote people out. How do we strike a balance that this bill is trying to address? What would you say to that?
Absolutely. I mean, the heart of the reason why this job is of interest to me came back to that degree of intimacy that occurs at the local level. There is, you heard some of the practicalities of the challenge to be here. And this is a very open body. This is the people's chamber. People can come in and be here, but that's still a big commitment for a state as large as Kansas. But when it comes down to the city levels, when it comes down to the school levels, you know your neighbors. I participated in the city of Topeka, hosted a forum on homelessness a number of weeks back. And there were two young women that came and participated and said, I've never done anything like this before, but I think it's a really important issue. You can engage at the local level in a way that is not possible anywhere else. And so it does demand a degree of individual responsibility. The Benjamin Franklin line of, we've delivered a republic if you can keep it. We do need our citizenry to remain engaged. And from the league's standpoint, we get to help those at the local level do so in a right and effective manner.
You do understand, though, somebody who may be opposed to what you're advocating up here, what kind of a voice do they have? Would they have to hire a lobbyist?
But they get to go talk to their council members in a way that isn't possible at other levels of government. Same with their school boards. And that's something that it gets just significantly harder when you move it to the state or the federal level. That degree of accessibility is not happening in a way that it can happen at the local level. That's the place where we think that engagement is most likely if there is that discontentedness for how things are happening.
Okay, thank you. I think Elena has some answers on the question with regard to post-audit study.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, in 2018, it looks like there was a legislative post-audit done on lobbying services, and it evaluated a small sample of local governments' reported payments to lobbyists and associations with lobbyists. And if you would like, I can send a copy of that report to the committee.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that very much. Senator Holscher.
So are we talking about the NEA?
NEA, they are not here, but I'm talking about that's also a
Okay, but that's not publicly funded.
through the teachers' dues. It's indirectly funded through teachers'
That's
dues.
not taxpayer funded.
Their teachers are paid by taxpayers. Public taxes support public schools. Those teachers indirectly pay the dues to the NEA. So it is indirectly, yes.
That's a long.
Yeah. Senator Longbine.
So I think that goes back to my point on publicly funded. So we're directly and indirectly?
I think that's the intent of the bill. So that's why it would need some work, I think, on the language and determination how that is.
Guess it's a good thing I'm not lobbying myself, because I think I've received revenue from the city of Emporia. So I guess that would make me ineligible.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 373. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, committee, for your indulgence here on a post-Chiefs Monday, and we are adjourned.